Hello. Our story begins several months after the official end of the Clone War. The galaxy had reached a state of semi-dystopia. Many senators were dealing with the ramifications of the rise of the Empire. Their greatest concerns focused on the budget they had to spend in their daily lives. Imperial senators, like those who served the Republic dedicatedly, were very easy to figure out. After all, it's why the galaxy was sitting in the predicament it was sitting in. They let in a powerful senator and handed the keys to the kingdom over to him. His role was simple at first, but it manifested itself into the ultimate power of the Republic. Palpatine's ascension came with the final layer of poison instilled into the Senate. The system itself was on the brink of collapse. Corruption and greed controlled everything, and Palpatine could be seen in many ways as a savior. But now that he was Emperor, now that he was full in control of the Empire's destiny, the rules had changed. Palpatine's rise came with the need to acknowledge who he truly was, something no one had done yet. On Coruscant, the central location of power in the galaxy, credits flowed like rivers of untouched planets galaxy-wide. These credits were the word of mouth for late Republic-era senators. There was no dedication to public service. Many of the senators who actually cared about the people had already bitten the bullet, so to say. Mina Bonteri and Anaconda Farr were assassinated. Padme died of natural complications, and Satine Kryze was killed by an attack made by pirates, leaving Mandalore to rot in civil war. The public servants of an era of peace had been vanquished, and yet there remained the problem. The Republic worked off of balance. Without it, there was nothing to keep it together. The foundation of debate and argument were necessary for any democracy to thrive. And while even the late Republic wasn't fully fledged in the practices of democratic systems, it was still what it was. Individuals like Padme Amidala, Bail Organa, Mon Mothma were absolutely crucial for going up against individuals like Lot Dod, Nix Card, and Goom Sam. But therein lay the greatest problem. There was no competition anymore. Those who, even considered rightly, challenged the rule of the Emperor were silenced by hazing by Imperial troopers, royal guards, or elite mercenaries. Emperor Palpatine's grip entrapped the entire Empire, but where he messed up drastically is the dedication of these senators and representatives. The truth about war is the profit. Canto Bight, for example, had many billionaires roll through their town, propping a small village on the coast of Cantonica into a beautiful luxury resort for the richest and most powerful individuals in the galaxy. These credits, used to build a rich getaway, were funded by the Clone War. In the same way war dogs, big and small, made a profit off the war, senators, representatives, and politicians gained power and credits from it too. There were those more concerned with being public servants like Organa and Amidala, but most of everyone else cashed in. It was a great time for them to be alive. The Trade Federation, banking clans, and Commerce Guild all had proper representation within the Senate, but everything changed. Lot Dod was killed at the end of the Clone War, and the influence of the Trade Federation was diminished almost immediately, as the Empire took full control over all the Federation's assets. The banking clans were absorbed by Chancellor Palpatine before the end of the Clone War, during an operation to make Rush Clovis look like a traitor to the Republic, and expose the clans for harboring untrustworthy business practices. The entire setup put power into Sidious's control, and Dooku just let it happen. The reason this posed such a large issue for the senators of the Empire was because of, and solely due to the fact, that their pocketbooks started to shrink. With war and megacorporations housing most of the talking space inside the Senate chambers during the war, individuals who could be seen as potential threats to Palpatine were paid off by the corporations that were funding the war on both sides. They had their political influence on Coruscant, which also came with mass amounts of credits, but they also had their militaristic influence with the Confederacy, which no one really knew about. As assets of these massive corporations fell under the control of the Empire, credits for senators started to dry up. This by no means meant that they were going broke. Senator payouts were considerably high by galactic standards, but the luxury at which these people had become accustomed to was changed. Though Palpatine wasn't dumb, the formation of the Empire required a lot of quick changes. Absorbing the clans and Federation weren't easy to do, but they were manageable. The struggle came from not having an errand boy like Dooku to do all of his external work for him, so individuals like Vice Admiral Rampart, Governor Tarkin, and Visor Maz Amedda became instrumental in propelling the Empire forward. In that process, though, individuals like CIS Senator Avi Singh were able to slip through the cracks in Imperial protocol, which was meant to capture senators of the Confederacy. This was important for a number of reasons, but the greatest was their influence. Despite the Clone War having dragged out longer than it needed to be, many senators had friends or allies that split off with the Separatists. And while vitriol had become commonplace during the war, when it came to its conclusion, those who didn't see active combat, i.e., senators, they didn't hold extreme resentment. Everyone in both governments profited, aside from those who unfortunately died. These former CIS senators and representatives were able to establish contact with some of their former friends. A couple Imperial politicians would rat them out, others would not. Those who were not exposed to Imperial troopers were able to talk their way into their friends' minds and hearts. The political landscape had altered significantly, and with the implementation of chain codes becoming more widespread in the months following Rampart's death on Wayland in 18 BBY, the Senate started to become antsy. Public service was never in their best interest, but as they started to lose their power and financial luxuries, they were faced with an ultimatum. Many senators had heard rumors that the Emperor's poison wasn't as thick as it was originally believed to be. His influence was widespread, but the surface of such power did not determine its strength. Palpatine was built on war. His position was fragile because he was a political mind. Had he been a general or admiral during the war, then there would be a different story about this. But he was sitting peacefully on Coruscant until the battle that essentially ended the war. If these senators, those who were never concerned with public service, were faced with the idea of losing what little influence they had left, then they could become temperamental. Palpatine's fear of losing influence was the true dent in his armor. He couldn't get away from it, and the Empire, as it was spread out, became increasingly more hostile. This meant that constituents of hundreds of politicians within the Senate had their mail blown up with rage. They had a choice to lose their power, minuscule influence, and considerably high profit, or they could do their jobs. The reason this ultimatum was placed on many of their desks was because the war was bad, but people wanted to move on. Palpatine's chain codes, Imperial stormtroopers, military presence, and the military-industrial complex was weighing down the people of systems galaxy-wide. Even more for the constituents was the fact that the Separatists just vanished. This was odd in of itself, but if they were going to just vanish, then there was no reason for the people of the galaxy to pay the price for a war they didn't want and military occupation that they didn't need. Palpatine wanted to assert his control and influence, and the people who were tired of hearing his name every day for 14 years wanted their freedom from his corruption. The greatest irony about the final notice given to these senators and representatives is that the only reason they actually cared was because of their corruption. It was something Sidious had managed to slightly overlook. In all fairness, a lot was going on around him in the first year and a half following Order 66, but he didn't seem to properly register that corruption was in the blood of his Senate. The truth regarding the Imperial Senate is the fact that they didn't have much power, comparatively to what they had before the Clone War. Many of them were fine with that at the time, because they were getting paid hand over fist, so as long as the credits kept rolling, then who cared? But this is where Palpatine messed up. The assets he had secured from the Federation and clans weren't spent inside the Senate to keep the senators happy or at bay. It was spent on projects for his empire, whether it be at Mount Tantus, that they now had to rebuild somewhere else, the Tarkin Doctrine, which was getting its legs, or Orson Krennic's proposed plan called Stardust. Credits and supplies from these mega corporations were used by Palpatine for furthering the power of the Empire. While he wasn't present for most discussions within the Senate, Masameda had his first struggle with a senator following the unveiling of the Imperial Star Destroyer. It had been in use for a good couple months before they actually publicly revealed it to the Senate. The showing off of another powerful vessel for a war that wasn't happening made these senators not getting their luxury pay upset. The first individual to chirp up was a devout Palpatine loyalist, one of the first people to cast a vote for him after Valoran was removed. They had remained allies for over the past decade and a half, but now, with his credits at an all-time minimum, and his influence preparing to slip away by the votes of his constituents, he told the Senate, his colleagues, and the Vizier that this empire was built on lies. The people of the Senate turned their attention to him. This was a huge deal. Palpatine loyalists never spoke out against the Emperor, not even when he was Chancellor. Bail Organa, Ryu Chuchi, and Mon Mothma did, but that was to be expected. They had openly been against his policy for most of the Clone War. But if someone so close to the Emperor could turn on a heel, then it had to be worth considering or at least hearing. The individual spoke about the chain code system, the implementation of Imperial outposts at every corner of the galaxy, and the drastic growth of a military that was clearly not needed. The senator turned to his colleagues, as the air was taken out of the room by his clear and concise points. For the first time in over a decade, this politician was working on behalf of his constituents without lazily dragging his feet. He understood the decision to create the TK Trooper program, firmly believing that a home-raised military was necessary for the continued strength of the Empire. But this was madness. They were subjugating their own citizens, and for what? The Separatists vanished off the face of the galaxy. There hadn't been reports of Separatist battle droids in over a year, and yet their military continued to grow. Why? He turned to each of the members in the chamber, letting the silence wash over them, letting the words sit idly in their minds for a short moment. Despite being nothing but a complacent politician, taking his power and his credits, he was still great at his job. The credits dried up and it was time to lock in or go back to the government on his home world, which wouldn't pay nearly as much. After his pause, he returned and pointed to each of them. They won the Clone War with Venators. They weren't even warships, let alone battleships. They were carriers. The Imperial ones were beautiful vessels, no one denied that. But why did they need to spend all their credits on ships like that when they had their military that had already won their war, and if Separatist rebels returned, then they would win it again with the Venators? From pods beside, above, and below him, people called out with vitriol towards the Star Destroyers, some towards the TKs, and everyone towards Masameda. The Vizier didn't panic, as he silenced their concerns, informing them of another lie, suggesting that they had reports of the Separatists gathering up in the Outer Rim. The Senate cut through his line and told him that if the Separatists wanted to align themselves with the Hutts or Crimson Dawn, then they could take them on. They already had access to Jabba's trade routes, and what did it matter anyways? Send in the clones for their last hurrah, and let the TKs learn from veteran troopers. Afterwards, they'd have more influence in the galaxy and they could have more credits to go around. Moss then realized where the senator was going with all of this, and decided to send the session into a recess, so that he may address the senator's concerns privately, but the issue was already presented. While Masameda and Sidious were conjuring up a plan to cease these deliberations and return the Senate to a state of passive existence, the remnants of the delegation of 2000 were getting to work. Ryo Chuchi had called a forum to try and get those who just now opposed Palpatine onto their good side. Ryo clocked the same thing that Masameda did. The only reason this individual wanted change was because his credits weren't as high as they used to be. She relayed this information back to Mon Mothma and Bail Organa just in case they didn't catch it. The delegation were very quick to spread out and start speaking to their colleagues about a potential government shutdown, to see if they could get Palpatine to change things up for them. The issue for Bail was his great concern regarding the fact that Sidious was a Sith, but he was afraid that Palpatine would use his powers or even troops against the Senate. He clearly wasn't afraid of hazing individuals or putting others on thin ice through various other methods. The question was how he might handle an entire Senate turning against him. To Bail and Ryo, they theorized that he would go through a more secretive route, believing that Palpatine couldn't at this point openly target the entire Senate. If he did, he could lose more support from the core, being that much of the core was built off and around corruption, much of which was long seated inside the Senate. That again being the irony of all of this. Corruption was being used for good, because the corruption at the current state wasn't benefiting anyone but Palpatine. The following few days of recess would be super stressful for everyone involved. Those who were once stalwarts of Palpatine's power were seeing how truly unfavorable his rule could be. And the truth is, with extra time to do their work, for a Senate session that would gain attention from the media and even constituents, it was important to know all the facts. Some of these facts were going back to the Clone War, and how some of these formerly loyal Palpatine advocates were going to betray him for their own good. All that mattered, in the current state, was the influence of one politician over another. A united democracy was not the goal of these former loyalists. They didn't care about the former delegation of 2000's righteous pursuit of democracy republic. These individuals only cared about what it would do for them, and how they would benefit from it financially. If they could scapegoat Palpatine to restore influence into their hands, then those assets secured by the Empire could be turned over to them. The entire inspiration for this plan was to cut Palpatine out, through a forcible removal, which no one really knew how they were going to do. And then, They would transfer the vast equity acquired by these megacorporations during the Republic era and use whatever they had left to fill their own pockets. Following their first act of official policy in years, they would elect a fool to represent them and keep the credits flowing, and maintain the look of a busy government, one that desperately cared about the people of the galaxy. But in all actuality, they couldn't care less. When the Senate hearing finally came, days after a quiet deliberation, the Emperor himself finally made an appearance. Nowadays, he addressed the Senate whenever he had something important to reveal. The most identifiable case were the chain codes, TK troopers, and the ISD revelation. The Sith Emperor stood silently on his podium, with a vizier next to him. Bail Organa watched with anticipation. He had reached out to his friend Rex, hoping that he could help, but Rex couldn't. The initial idea was to use the inhibitor chip against Palpatine, because the Senate was mostly crawling with Coruscant guardsmen. But Rex didn't know any of the activation orders aside from Order 66, so he couldn't really do anything to help the senators, just in case, or just preemptively. This left Bail and the rest of the Senate in an awkward predicament. If their case to the galaxy didn't go favorably, then they might be out of luck. Palpatine addressed the concerns about funding that were previously mentioned, and he mentioned how the concerns of the Senate were validated, and he wished to course correct. With him, he propped up holograms across the entire Senate chambers, including detailed reports on each of their pods. The reports on their pods were sensitive information not for the public, whereas the holograms depicted what was information the Empire wanted its citizens to see, those who were watching. Sidious carried on, his decrepit and old voice echoing out across the chamber. The reports listed on each of their pods showed the success of the chain codes, and why the former Vice Admiral's work was being spread out. On the accounting side, he had forged documents, but no one needed to know that. All the credits being used for the destroyers, TK Trooper armor, and their weapons, not to mention the repainting done for Venators, were listed as cheaper than previously reported. The reasoning Palpatine gave was the fact that the cost of products dropped since the war ended. Of course, not to mention the widespread control over trade routes established in the disintegration of the Trade Federation and Commerce Guild. This right here is what made Palpatine such a dangerous individual. He always found a way to cover his tracks, and lay things down in a perfectly curated lie. Palpatine placed his hands together and promised his allies and the constituents of the galaxy that this was not the Republic. They were not burdened by Jedi rebels or corruption from megacorporations. They were united and stronger than ever before. As he looked around, he asked if any senators or representatives had concerns that they would like to address. The chambers fell on silence for longer than anyone cared to admit, until a voice called out from the other side of Palpatine's pod. Their podium lifted up and spun around the chambers, before seating itself right in front of Palpatine. The senator expressed that she had aided a great many individuals with getting acceptance into varying levels of the Imperial and Republic Academy before, during, and after the war. She rolled her pod around and expressed that the reports Palpatine presented were either inaccurate or they were estimates that did not fully represent the transaction in place for Imperial military productions. A whistleblower from Kuat had reached out to her. Kuat had consistently been the cheapest production distributor of Republic-era vessels. This individual who requested to not be named had the factual report of transactions issued out by the Imperial banks, and the price was exponentially higher. If the budget displayed here was an accurate representation of the Empire and their funding for the war machine, then something was missing. The holograms around the room had been providing depictions of situations around the galaxy where relief efforts were being fronted by the Empire. Though these could be realistic, there was no conclusive evidence to suggest that this was widespread. The senator continued, with ears across the chamber and the galaxy drawn on this moment. She said that representation from the Confederacy also provided proof that these cases were not common anymore. Instead, troopers created by the Empire were being sent into former hostile territory to issue different iterations of martial law, not provide relief as shown on the holograms. She firmed her statement, suggesting that the Imperial budget called for more actions for the people of the galaxy, which, side note, benefited the senators more than anyone else, and these budget reports weren't calculating what was being shown at the shipyards of Kuat, which again provided the best deal to Republic and Imperial war machines. The Senate was left in silence, as Palpatine, slowly but assertively, said that these whistleblowers must come forward. The reports he received were proof enough that the individuals were running a smear campaign against him, in an effort to destabilize his attempts to maintain order in the Empire. Palpatine villainized those who stood against him. Individuals who supported him would villainize those who opposed his rule, no matter how large or minuscule their quote-unquote smear was. Senators around the chamber knew that she would drop this bombshell, and when it was delivered they were not disappointed, though they were not finished there. Of course, they were trying to rein some influence back into their control, but most importantly, their luxurious payrolls were what they cared about most. The Senate suggested, openly and publicly, that the Empire hold a general election to decide if the route of an empire should continue, or if they make a peaceful return to democracy so that the benefit of the people could be decided by the people. This was something many knew was coming, and when it came, it was supported and upheld rapidly. Palpatine giving these senators days to work on the rebuttal was a failure on his part, because it allowed them to come up with their own plan. These individuals have been scamming their constituents for decades, and while the former delegation of 2000 wanted to get the public service side of things done, the bare minimum of change, which was getting rid of Palpatine, was worth compromising for. Democratically, they would have more influence than not in changing policy to reflect their needs. They couldn't do that under a monarchy. Very quickly, Palpatine responded though. The Senate demanded a chance to change their fate with the assistance of the people of the galaxy. Their rejection of Palpatine's empire came with a determination to seize their own power, because corruption was the name of their game, and it now no longer benefited them. Until it did, it wasn't favorable to any of them. Because Sidious had full belief that he could win this, specifically by taking control with his already established control, he would weed out those most affected by his empire and cheat his way to victory. So he calmly agreed to stay the course and see this movement through because it meant something to his colleagues, and thus, it meant something to him. When the session was over, he ordered Masameda to begin his smear campaign. He wanted a separatist resurgence to come and strike a base of clone troopers. They were expendable. He also wanted to make sure the chain codes were used to their full potential. They would be the key to winning this thing. The chain codes told Imperial troops everything they needed to know about an individual, so those who were most affected by the Empire wouldn't have their chance to vote due to misdemeanors or offenses small enough that anyone, even a royal guard, would overlook it. This was going to be his victory, without a hitch. Though there was one more key importance. Those who whistleblew would be propped up as individuals linked to the rising separatist movement, as to link the senators back to the separatists. Palpatine always planned ahead. Those separatist reserve fleets were destroyed, except for a phantom fleet as he called it. The fleet was stationed outside of Scarif for the time being, just in case he needed it. Good thing he did. He would use it to make an attack, and show off the power of the Imperial Navy, and how necessary Palpatine's protection would be. His ISB would also get to work on infringing the rights of those who weren't Palpatine aligned, as well as targeting every single senator and forcing them to buckle. He wouldn't kill them, but he would scare them, which is exactly what he planned on doing. The election was planned for 6 months in advance, and they would be grueling for everyone. There was the attack on the Midrim planet, that not only completely exterminated the last large group of clone troopers, killing Commander Bakker and about 600 clones, but the town of civilians were also massacred. And then the TK troopers and their Star Destroyers showed up, and it was a massive victory for the Empire, seen as their first step into a new direction. Those who were coined as whistleblowers during the Senate hearings were connected back to the Separatists through ISB intermingling, and this of course forced the Senator out of the Senate, and a new Palpatine loyalist in. The rounds continued from there. Many of the politicians on Coruscant would have their bones broken, as they'd be harassed by everything, sometimes citizens, other times mercenaries. It didn't matter. This was meant to scare people, and it did work. Some of these senators saw their quest for more credits to not be worth it in the end. Every single member of the Imperial Senate knew that Palpatine was going to cheat. They put up with his antics during the Clone Wars because it benefited them, and now they had the choice to do the right thing for the wrong reason. Though this double down from delegation senators encouraged others to stay the course, as it promised something that they could have back. The greed they desired was becoming more and more infectious the longer they went without having all the benefits of it, and they'll use this to his and his colleagues' advantage and agenda. See, everyone knows someone, and because they do, there were allies that could manipulate this so that they could save their own republic from this villain. If Palpatine lost, then they could forcibly remove him, as he would no longer have power. But the issue is, how would the Republic retain that power? Well, it meant that these senators had to make numerous deals with the devil. The funny dynamic here was former delegation senators teaching corrupted souls how to be politicians, and soulless demagogues teaching their colleagues how to be sleazy bastards. Their ability to control the game in their favor, for themselves, is what got them into the Senate to begin with. Some initially started out with the desire to do good, others just wanted power. At the end of the day, all of them became similar. Their focus was inward, and it would be the deciding factor here. Senators weaseled their way into everyone's pockets. If it were electric maintenance crews, imperial officers, crewmen, admirals, or moths, they found a way to make this manageable. Many of the delegation didn't want to be tasked with it, but to ensure their alliance, they were forced to. Those who didn't care about the democracy itself knew that delegation members would try to forge a constitution to make it impossible for them to receive luxurious treatment after the fall of the Empire. So as a counter, they were able to split their forces. Half of them taught the delegation members how to be sleazy, and the other half helped create an official documentation for the coming alliance. The new system was very similar to the previous one, except instead of Chancellor, there'd be 3 councils, on top of which they would uphold the Vizier role, so that they could maintain Mas Amedda's loyalty, due to his popularity, regardless of policy making, and what he knew about Palpatine. Regardless of how grueling and tense this was, it flew by. The decision for the Republic or Empire was made, and the galaxy was left in shock. It was an overwhelming decision, made by both people and the Senate. This was a two-way vote. It went from both Senate and from people in the galaxy. The Senate had a 74 to 26% vote, which leaned towards Republic. However, the galaxy had an 81 to 19% vote, which too supported the rebirth of a galactic republic. Palpatine and the Senate were all gathered in the Senate chambers, and the shock was immeasurable. And he couldn't believe it. Everyone he had placed into power supported his rule. He subjugated individuals not of his favor to having no ability to vote. Didn't make any sense. Well, actually it didn't. Palpatine worked quickly to make sure everything went his way. He manipulated thousands of individuals with power. The only thing is, the Senate promised more than he could. With the assistance of hackers and individuals close to the Emperor, they were able to find out what he was offering to these people. Most individuals didn't think much of this information. Palpatine offered the bare minimum, and since their odds were extremely unfavorable as it was, the bare minimum sounded good. The senators offered a bit more than that, something to turn the odds, but they could only receive it if they didn't support Palpatine or give him a chance to match their price. They accepted these terms mostly. Those who didn't were replaced through different methods. The key to the Republic vote winning wasn't truth, just like how Palpatine's vote would have been a lie. The Senate knew Palpatine was planning to cheat. They just maximized their resources to ensure they had their own protection because he would cheat. They had to form some bills that would get unanimous support upon the rebirth of the Republic, ones that would flip the entire Imperial military back into their control. Thanks to contracts senators had with military personnel they assisted in getting to academies and so forth, they were able to avoid the most loyal Palpatine dogs in the military and oust them whenever the time came, chief among them being Tarkin. Because the Empire was rejected, the Senate called for Palpatine's removal, which he did agree to. The only reason he did is because he would retake the Senate with force, but that wasn't an option anymore, and he didn't realize it. Because the Senate had done so much work in the past 6 months to make sure they had all the documentation ready to support their new government. As TK Imperial shock troopers escorted Palpatine out of the Senate chambers, the senators acted quickly, voting into First Council Alderaanian Senator Bail Organa, Second Council Umbaran Senator Maedechi, and Third Council Tara Senator Tyne Rapalmo. They quickly signed into action the Constitution, and an array of military bills that would financially benefit the entire Imperial military for a few short years, after of course understanding where all military credits were going. Tarkin, as soon as the votes were in, was captured and sent to the Spire on Stygon Prime, with a handful of other Palpatine loyalists within the military. Sidious had already told his apprentice the plan, just in case a scenario like this happened. His job was to make a guest appearance. In a similar manner to Maul or Dooku, Palpatine would use Vader to do all of his dirty work. Vader's job was simply to exterminate the Senate, and then Palpatine could return with power. The only thing Palpatine continued to overlook was the crippling effect his system had on even his own interests. See, a corrupt system thrives off of greed. This one had benefited Palpatine for so long that some of the simple things were overlooked by he and his advisors. His luck had to run out at some point, in all fairness, but the truth is, he never would have anticipated the senators getting into the pockets of the Imperial military. Palpatine had planned a military coup just in case he failed, because in the 6 months leading up to the election, enlistment numbers soared higher than ever before in Imperial or Republic history. New destroyers were rolled off the assembly line, and therefore, he was well equipped with individuals ready to fight for his empire and for him. However, most of the individuals who got into the academies that placed them into officer roles got into said academies thanks to personal letters of recommendation by Imperial or, at the same time, Republic senators. The senators set these young men and women up for careers across the Empire, ones in which they would get great success, and now they were serving their new government. Palpatine tried to contact his closest allies, those who were stationed outside of Coruscant, specifically Tarkin's fleet, so that he could be freed. When such freedom didn't come, he was flustered. Palpatine killed his guards and took his shuttle towards the Imperial fleet above the planet. At the same time, inside of the Senate building, the senators were quickly evacuated through a series of transports, and Vader was doing as his master requested of him. His lightsaber was crushing through his enemies, and they were trying to protect the new leadership of the galaxy. Luckily, the Senate knew Palpatine would attempt this, so they had hundreds of troopers ready to defend. Vader was aided by the Royal Guard, because they were dismissed after Palpatine's capture. As the Sith Lord flew towards the fleet, he informed them that he was here to meet with Tarkin, an individual who was already directed in hyperspace. The Imperials knew Palpatine was an enemy, so instead of shooting him down, a number of explosives were placed in and around the landing deck, and it was cleared. Now, yeah, this would damage the destroyer, but that was a necessary risk. When Palpatine landed, a number of stormtroopers gathered around the exterior of the hangar bay. Once the ship dropped its gears, the stormtrooper with the best shot on the explosives fired, and they missed. Another stormtrooper had to take the shot, and guess what? He missed too. At least the third time's a charm, because, just kidding. How many stormtroopers does it take to hit a stationary target? At least 5. Palpatine was rushing out of the shuttle when the explosion rocked the ship, launching debris into space, and among them, stormtroopers and Palpatine himself. His body was shredded by the explosion, but to everyone's surprise, he was still alive. Though they fired their surface cannons at the Sith Lord, who used the Force to hold on to life, creating a protection bubble around himself, similar to what Mother Townsend would do, and he saved his body, until he was rocked by a turbo laser, and that was that. Inside the Senate building, every single senator escaped, as TK troopers killed the remaining of the Royal Guard, but struggled immensely with Vader. The Inquisitors were left with a choice then. Who did they support? The Sith Lord, who tortured them, or the new Senate? Truthfully speaking, they all knew that Vader hated them, so this was their opportunity to seize some control for themselves. Grand Inquisitor led his small group of Inquisitors to the Senate building, where Vader fended off incoming attacks from these foolish TKs. They were no match for the power in him, and he slaughtered them without hesitation or struggle. The Inquisitors arrived on the scene and started their pursuit of Vader. He was in the middle of the corridor, trying to break into the Senate chambers, but he couldn't. He wasn't struggling, but he wasn't able to break down the continuously growing number of TK troopers. Vader's weapon cut through each and every single opponent with ease. As he was doing this, the Inquisitors charged in. He turned back and was thrown into a pillar, purely because he didn't anticipate their coming attack. He ducked and parried, throwing one of them back. He reached out his arm, crushing Merrick, who turned into dust, and then Vader turned around to clobber another one of his opponents. The TKs, unsure of who the enemy was, fired at the Inquisitors too, just to be safe, which only ended up helping Vader. By this point, the Dark Lord knew that the fight was lost, and he had no interest in losing his life to a fight that really didn't matter to him anymore. He crushed the windpipe of another Inquisitor, before using the Force to launch the Grand Inquisitor down the hall and into the firing line of the TK troopers, where he was executed. Revenge would not do wonders for the will to live in this case.
Goodbye.
Vader used his starfighter to exit Coruscant, through the atmosphere over the works, and vanish from Coruscant to understand his own purpose in life. Without Palpatine, having sensed his death, and only 2 years into his suit, and life as a Sith, his own desires for a Sith life hadn't fully manifested themselves. Not only that, but his assault on the Senate would have him barred from Imperial territory if the Senate mandate stood. On Coruscant, after a terrifying and very shocking day for the galaxy, Imperial troops would secure the planet and remove the Palpatine loyalists immediately. This ousting was seen by Palpatine supporters as injustice, that it was done to stop the tyranny that manipulated an entire populace. Part of the reason these senators agreed on the idea of keeping Mas Amedda as vizier was because of his closeness with Palpatine. In such a relationship, he was able to reveal to the galaxy, but first the Senate, every single forged document, and the real numbers. Not just that, but the interworking of Projects Necromancer, Stardust, and a number of other high-security operations that were taking credits away from the remainder of Federation and banking clan reserves. This therein left another issue for the now reforming Republic. They made deals that needed to be certified if they wanted a chance at obtaining political control over the former empire. They had a bunch of budget packages that would benefit the military specifically, but written in legal speak, it would also reduce the size of the military in the years to come. So most if not all the officers who agreed to join the Senate itself were unaware of this legal speak. Also, because the Senate understood the implications of forfeiting so much of their budget into the military at such a desperate time, they decided that the best way to step forward after defeating Palpatine was declaring another war. This obviously wasn't what people wanted, and while many people didn't know that the Senate manipulated an already manipulated vote, they prepared for what would be another grueling conflict. Though unlike the Clone War, this coming conflict would be exclusively in the Outer Rim. It would not touch Imperial citizens. If Palpatine was going to build a military, they might as well get the most out of it, so they did, using it to besiege the Outer Rim, and use that war to fund both personal investments for themselves, but also build up what was already a depleted budget for the populace of the galaxy. The Senate worked with so many credits, it was hard to fathom for any one individual. With Bail Organa as first consul, they were able to work with him on some sprawling ideas for reinvestment bills, which many were initially disgruntled with. But Bail was one of the best speakers inside the Senate chambers, and he had a very likable position, both as being himself and also as Alderaan's representative. His budget balancing would assist many people, while even paying off some of the senators that resided within these very chambers. Despite the political backlash this would receive, Bail made sure the clones got their fair share of equal treatment too, and those left in the sewers and gutters by Palpatine's rule were lifted out of it and given homes. The Assembly of Galactic Interests became the new government of the galaxy by title. However, most people just called it TAG. War in the Outer Rim was initially of concern, but the TK troopers fought valiantly, and this combat gave time for the Senate to elicit bills into a position to favor themselves and even their constituents. It obviously wasn't much for the constituents involved, but Bail did the best he could, without unlimited power. Out on Rat Attack, Vader would champion himself as a gladiator inside the pits of the Cauldron, because he had nowhere else to really go. He did have a small desire to try and find Obi-Wan, but he decided on the showmanship path. Vader thrived as a gladiator, and he would remain here as champion of the underworld, something that gave him fulfillment on his own, without ever having to vow loyalty to the Jedi or the Sith. He would never learn of his children, mostly because those who knew who Vader was would never learn that Vader was down here. By the time Kenobi started to search for Anakin, Vader's title had simply become Champion of the Underground, something that didn't mean anything to Obi-Wan. Luke and Leia would grow up individually in a much different era, and they would get to know each other eventually. Tag control over the galaxy reached the Outer Rim. While Leia would become an influential senator when she reached the age of 16, following her biological mother's footsteps, Luke would join the Tag Academy, stationed in the Outer Rim. Obi-Wan did try to stop him, but Owen again interjected, believing that Luke should be free from the Force and the Jedi. Kenobi had already done enough to the Skywalker family. Ouch. Obi-Wan would then search for other Jedi and start rebuilding the Lost Order. When the Outer Rim fell into Tag hands, it was given fair representation as senators from the core used their influence to rein in the military forged by Palpatine. Their efforts were noted by a few officers who decided to run for office against them. Some would win, others would not. Though the several-year combat saw many casualties, it would be coined as a crusade, and that made most people more patriotic about it. A lot of this patriotism for Tag came from the fact that many Palpatine-era problems were criminalized, specifically the chain code system, which no one liked. The Tag government wasn't perfect by any means, and it did reflect a lot of attributes belonging to the Republic of old. But the lesson learned from Palpatine would be influential on the reforming of their government. In the most ironic ways, the senators of the modern era wouldn't ever see that they were the reason Palpatine rose to power. With Tag established, they would return to their own version of luxury, which was lesser than Clone War wealth, but much higher than Imperial, so it was very sustainable. Despite this, it would be the new generation, the next one, the one who had to live under the imprisonment of Palpatine for almost 2 years, that became the voices of reason. Bail would remain first counsel for the first members of this new generation, as they reached the Senate, and it would be there where the next generation would get their chance to shine. They had seen the worst of the worst, and they had seen growth by mediocrity. It would be up to them to determine the future of the galaxy, an undertaking that they would handle with grace and dedication, free from corruption. And that, my friends, is our story. Again, special thanks to all of our patrons: General Wells, Darth Maelstrom, Ozpin, Darth Vitiate, Seju Jagger, Brood36, Hunter Belden, Rosebird, Angel Dust, Alexander Reese, The Beginning and End, Jango Fett Clone, Nick5098, Ben Ingram, The Big Red Pure Mark, Diamond Constant, Darth Nemesis, Lord Tib, CC2024, Gallivan Gaming, Tristan, Mandalore, Sir William 1767, Darth Revan, Granite D-Bane, Laliant, Sky Guy, Penguin, Colin Rooney, Shark Midori, RG38, Nick, Michael Erlinger, The Last Jedi, Apollo, Weewas670, Anakin Stank Runner, CT7567, Toaster Oven, Oz of Oz, Darth Nox, The Eternal Padawan, Joshua Tem, Johnny DeGuin, Sense Skeleton, Jedi Sloth, Mr. E Gamer, Lord Cali, Youngling Slayer 66, Mammoth Studios, Anakin003, Lord Draken, 46 Star Wars, Erebus, Rex the Wolf, Man with 3 First Names, Darkseid46, Baron Joshua, and Lord Deadwing. For supporting the channel, smash that like button. Giveaway down below, 140k is the number. Let's talk about this story. Wow, different, a little bit, lots going on here. I think the idea of focusing on the Senate itself and how this corruption is the only reason that they would get out of it is, I believe, the only reason that this story would work. I don't think the Senate would have some righteous change of policy. I don't think that the Imperial era senators would be like, oh, actually, Palpatine's the coolest guy ever. Like, they continually forfeit their power to him all the way up until Jeddah. And then they're like, yo, what the F was that? And Palpatine's like, your imagination, get gaslit, bro. And so I think the only way that this would fundamentally work is if the Senate was like, oh, your corruption is benefiting you and not all of us. All of us want to eat, and so therefore you cannot eat. And so their entire gripe with Palpatine is that he's not corrupt enough for them. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed Star Wars C-SPAN. I love you all, spread the love, and always remember, my friends, may the Force be with you.